Well, welcome to everybody who's joining today. As you know, we're working our way through the book of Genesis. And in all these stories, we're seeing like parts of a puzzle that eventually are going to fit together into a big narrative. And it's the story of God's infinite love for us to save us and bless us through his son, Jesus. Chapter 36 and 37 explore the themes of blessings, the complexities of family, and God's faithfulness and sovereign power. So I thought we should start with some prayer. Oh, Father, thank you for this day that you have made and that we can rejoice and be glad in it. We thank you for this space and time, Father, to study your word. And I ask today that you still all of us, Father, to just be all of the things that could distract us. Father, remove them so that we can hear from you today and learn the things that we need to learn. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so today's readings show the split in the line of Isaac between his two sons, Esau and Jacob. Chapter 36 is a genealogical record of Esau's lineage, and chapter 37 begins the story of Joseph, Jacob's son. Today, my study is mostly going to come from the notes from the ESV, the Bible Project, and Enduring Word study notes. I'm going to start with the key ideas from 36, but the actual reading I'm going to do is chapter 37, and I'm going to be using the NIV translation. So we know by now from previous chapters that genealogies, names, and places serve a purpose to teach us. And Esau, despite all his failings, still can teach us something about life choices, what we set our minds on, and again, this difficulty and the complexities of families. So Esau, that, as we know, is the firstborn son of Isaac and Rebekah, twin to Jacob, who carelessly sells his birthright for a bowl of stew. He's tricked out of his firstborn blessing by his mother and brother. And while Esau did not get his father's blessing, if you were to read chapter 36 as a standalone, one might say that Esau went on to have, by the world's standard, a successful life. And I underlined in my notes, world's standard. Esau was the father of the Edomite nation, which today on a map is located in the southern area of Jordan. The kingdom of Edom and the Edomites are mentioned 130 times in the Bible. They were an important group of neighbors to Israel. And in the beginning, God commanded special regard for the Edomites among Israel. And it says in Deuteronomy 23:7, "You shall not abhor an Edomite, for he is your brother." The Edomites and their descendants eventually proved to be great enemies of Israel. When we get to Numbers in chapters 20 and 21, we'll see that the Edomites refused the Israelites' passage through their land. And that was a great source of discouragement for Israel. In verses 1 to 5, we'll see that Esau had a very rich family life. And it lists the names of 3 women, Ada, Aholibama, and Basemath. Now, Pastor Rhonda taught a brilliant message at the Heart Conference on the importance of names and renaming. And if you can find that teaching and re-listen to it, I think that it would really help you to understand this whole idea of names. And yesterday when Max taught, he talked about how God renames Jacob. I think it was Max yesterday, but Jacob is renamed from the deceiver to Israel. Names hold meaning. In biblical thought, a name does not merely identify, it expresses the essential nature of its bearer. And Esau's wives all indicate qualities of the flesh. Their names mean beautiful, perfumed, and ornate, and it has nothing to do with a godly character or spirit. In chapter 26, Esau married a woman named Judith, and at first I wondered, why was she not listed in this chapter? So I investigated. And either Judith is not mentioned on purpose as a person of importance in his lineage, But researchers think that Judith was actually renamed somewhere along the line and listed as Oholibama. And the name Oholibama means idolatry because she was known to have built places for idols. Sorry, that's my coffee pot. And that is the name that is on record of what Esau valued. Now, these women bore him 5 sons and several daughters. It is important to note that Esau, in an act of rebellion and the flesh, took his wives from daughters of Canaan, which went against what Abraham had directed in chapter 24. The Canaanites worshipped idols and engaged in other practices that were offensive to God. A Canaanite would not have been worthy to join into a marriage covenant. To marry a daughter of Canaan would be marrying outside of the covenant. And Esau's intentional and defiant marriage to these women caused a lot of grief to Isaac and Rebekah because they knew he was out of line with what God wanted. So if you want to follow along, let's go to verse 6. I will read this part. Esau took his wives and sons and daughters and all the members of his household, as well as his livestock and all his other animals and all the goods he had acquired in Canaan, and moved to a land some distance from his brother Jacob. Their possessions were too great for them to remain together. The land where they were staying could not support them, both because of their livestock. So Esau, that is Edom, settled in the hill country of Seir. So if we think back to Genesis 27, after Esau has his blessing stolen, he cries out, "Have you only one blessing for me, Father?" And this proved in a way unfounded because God still blessed Esau as a descendant of Abraham, but God blesses him in a way that is the only way that Esau cares about, which is of material things. Esau's not struggling. He had to move because he had so much stuff that the land couldn't contain it. And Mount Seir was a preferred region that had a long history and would one day hold the rock city of Petra. And it said that it could only be reached through a narrow, winding gorge, and it was considered geographically defensible. It was said that a dozen men could protect Petra against a whole army. And this is interesting because later we're going to see God's sovereignty would decide the fate of Edom. Verses 9 to 43 list the names of the sons and descendants. And if we go back to thinking about what names hold and the value, some of these names go like this. Listen to what they mean. Alvin means wicked. Ithran means advantage. Many of the names also represent things of the earth, such as Aaron, it means mountain goat. Dishon means gazelle. And Baal Hanan, his name means that he embraced the false god of Baal. And Amalek is also mentioned. From him came the Amalekites, one of the first and greatest enemies of Israel. We also see, as you keep reading, that many of these people go on to become chiefs and kings. And maybe here it's where more clearly we see what God meant. Jacob I have loved, but Esau I have hated. Esau obviously was a blessed man outwardly, but he was hated and rejected in regard to being chosen to inherit the covenant God made to Abraham. Now, several of the prophets would come to speak out against Edom, including Obadiah, Jeremiah in chapter 49, and Ezekiel in chapter 25. Edom, despite a long and powerful history, would be wiped out, and all its strength, position, fame, and glory would soon be gone. Today, Jordan controls this land, and it's mostly unoccupied rocky terrain. It has been brought to just a wasteland or nothing, just as the prophets said it would be. So what can we learn from Esau? Well, we can see that it's God's desire to bless people. And I'm pretty sure it was Pastor Jeff who said this or something like this when he presented. Man can still meet with God, but sin waits at the door. God's grace in the midst of the mess is to give a path forward, but the condition of man is to go his own way. Esau made a series of bad choices that led his family in the wrong direction. Outwardly, or to the world, it might have looked like Esau had it all. But eventually, this would all become nothing. So, lessons to learn. Material things don't last forever. Treasures can be lost. Earthly kingdoms can fall. And beautiful trophies in time all lose their shine. Chapter 36 allows us to see generations of a family that went off track because of bad choices. We can see the importance of Colossians 3:2 that tells us to set your eyes on things above, not on earthly things, but things that are eternal. Jacob also made his fair share of mistakes. We're not forgetting that. But unlike Esau, he retained a relationship with the true and only God, the God of Isaac and Abraham. So we too have decisions to make. Will we serve the true God, Jesus, and teach our families to do the same? Or do we make compromises, maybe small ones, big ones, but that potentially could influence generations to come? And that brings us to guiding question number 1. Now, I took this question from Reg Bertrand when he taught last week because it's a great question. And sometimes when you gain more information, you can add to your understanding in your answer. So the question is this: what can we do today to impact our family legacy for God's glory? Chapter 37 is the beginning of the story of Joseph. Moses gives Joseph more time in Genesis than he does any other character, including Adam, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. From chapter 37 to 50, we are going to learn about his importance in God's redemptive plan for his people. The story of Joseph is a vivid representation of Romans 8:28, that all things work together for good for those who love God. In this story, the sovereignty of God, even in the most impossible of situations, Joseph finds a way to keep his covenant promises. Theologian James Montgomery Boyce says this about Joseph. He was loved and hated, favored and abused, tempted and trusted, exalted and abased. Yet, at no point in the 110-year life of Joseph did he ever seem to get his eyes off God or cease to trust him. Adversity didn't harden his character. Prosperity didn't ruin him. He was the same in private as in public. He was truly a great man. And we can see how God continually points to Jesus through Joseph's life. So as we read along and you start to see parallels, you were meant to see them. So let's read. I'm going to start reading this chapter, and I'll start at verse 1. Now Jacob dwelt in the land where his father was a stranger in the land of Canaan. This is the history of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brothers. And the lad was with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to his father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his children because he was the son of his old age. He also made him a tunic of many colors. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him, and they could not speak peaceably to him. Now, we all have ideas of what a perfect family should be, but I'm pretty sure that if we're honest, we can admit, all of us, that family conflicts and troubles are something that we can relate to. Jacob's family is filled with dysfunction and repetitive mistakes, but it's from this mess that Joseph emerges as one of the greatest characters in the Bible, a foreshadowing of Jesus who's going to come and set it all right again. Jacob outwardly favors Joseph, his son with Rachel. And we've seen when a parent chooses one over another, it never works well. The coat that Joseph is given sets him apart from his brothers who already can't stand him. He's younger, he's preferred, and the colorful coat is about as in your face as you could get. The coat's sleeves and hemline would have been longer than his brother's, indicating that he was not a worker or a laborer, but an overseer. It implied that one day he would assume the leadership in the family. And I read that it would be the equivalent of showing up in a three-piece suit to the family farm where your brothers are out doing the work. We don't know what the bad report was that Joseph told Jacob. So does that make him a tattletale, contributing to the mess by ratting out his brothers for something that we don't know? We need to remember, though, that he's young, 17, maybe acting like somebody who's pampered or a favorite and not aware of their privilege. Whatever his reasons for telling his brothers, even though he knows that they hate him, maybe helps us to understand the dynamics and challenges in this family and their eventual motive to kill him. I'm going to keep reading in verse 5. Now Joseph had a dream, and he told it to his brothers, and they hated him even more. So he said to them, "Please hear this dream which I've dreamed. There we were, binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose and also stood upright. And indeed, your sheaves stood all around and bowed down to my sheaf." And his brothers said to him, "Shall you indeed reign over us? Or shall you indeed have dominion over us?" And so they hated him even more for his dreams and his words. Now, reading this, you might be scratching your head wondering, what would be the motive for telling these dreams? Was he really just immature, fascinated that the dream was just too good to keep to himself? Or did he really believe right in that moment God was telling him something? The dream itself is not hard to figure out. The imagery of sheaves would have been obvious to his brothers. Joseph was telling them, and I'm sure he was wearing his very fancy coat when he told them, that he's going to be in a position of power and they're going to bow down to him. And whether at this point they believe the dream is true or not, the result only adds fuel to the fire, and it just makes them hate him more. The second dream, verse 9. Then he dreamed another dream and told it to his brothers and said, "Look, I've dreamed another dream. And this time the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars bowed down to me." So he told it to his father and his brothers, and his father rebuked him and said to him, "What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall your mother and I and your brothers indeed come to bow down to the earth before you?" And his brothers envied him, but his father kept the matter in mind. If Joseph was unwise to tell the first dream, knowing how much it irritated them the first time, then it had to have been worse to share this second one. This second dream caused more resentment because it set Joseph not only above his brothers, but also above his parents. In this instance, Joseph spoke when maybe he should have stayed quiet. His telling of the dream shows a bit of a prideful attitude of somebody who's favored. He was so focused on how great his dreams were for him, maybe he didn't consider how it would sound in the ears of others. I told you that in many instances, we're going to see parallels of Joseph to Jesus, but in this section, Joseph is a contrast to Jesus. Jesus wants us to be like how he was on earth, a person who puts others first. So Joseph seems to have fallen short in this area, maybe not using wisdom in who he told his dreams to, or discerning in that moment what God might have been speaking just to him. But the fact is, in Joseph's case, the dreams would one day come true. God's plan is sovereign, no matter the mistakes made. Verses 12 to 17 set the stage of how Joseph gets isolated and out in Dothan, where his brothers devise the plan to kill him. So you can jump ahead to verse 18. Now, when they saw him afar off, even before he came near them, they conspired against him to kill him. And they said to one another, "Look, this dreamer is coming. Come, therefore, let us now kill him and cast him into some pit, and we shall say, some wild beast has devoured him. We shall see what becomes of his dreams." The brothers have intense hatred, bitterness, and evil in their hearts. They don't just plan to get him out in the field and bully him or give him a hard time. It reads like an episode of 2020. They had the whole plan. They're going to conspire. They're going to plan out the details. They know what they're going to tell Jacob, what happened to him. And they mock Joseph for being a dreamer. And the plan is to kill him and his dreams. But what the brothers don't know is that Joseph's dreams are a revelation from God, and that can't be killed or stopped. Verse 21. But Reuben heard it, and he delivered him out of their hands and said, "Let us not kill him." And Reuben said to them, "Shed no blood, but cast him into this pit, which is in the wilderness, and do not lay a hand on him, that he might deliver him out of their hands and bring him back to his father." And so it came to pass, when Joseph had come to his brothers, that they stripped Joseph of his tunic, the tunic of many colors that was on him. Then they took him and cast him into a pit, and the pit was empty. There was no water in it, and they sat down to eat a meal. And then they lifted their eyes and looked, and there was a company of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with their camels, bearing spices, balm, and myrrh on their way to carry them down to Egypt. So Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is there if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother and our flesh." And his brothers listened. Then Midianite traders passed by. So the brothers pulled Joseph up, lifted him out of the pit, and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. And they took Joseph to Egypt. Reuben and Judah are the only two brothers named in this section. Each has their reasons to not kill Joseph, but neither are virtuous. Remember, this is a very, very damaged family. Reuben's motives were likely to regain favor with his father, which he lost in chapter 35 when he slept with Jacob's wife, Bilhah, and he's likely trying to secure his place as firstborn. His reason to save Joseph is entirely self-serving. Judah, not wanting blood on his hands and sees an opportunity for profit, sells him instead to the Ishmaelites who were passing through. Reuben returns to see Joseph not in the pit, and his reaction of ripping at his clothes and screaming, "Where shall I go?" likely means, now what am I going to do? As his opportunity to regain his father's favor is now gone with Joseph, who's on his way to Egypt. In these verses, the reader is just told of what happens. We don't hear Joseph's voice or know his thoughts as all of this unfolds. We're left to our imagination, the shock and horror of this as he realizes what is happening to him and the hopelessness of it all. The last words we hear from him are the dreams that he's going to rule over all his brothers. And in a sudden turn of events, everything changes, and he's physically beneath his brothers in a pit with no way out. Later on, in Genesis 42, his brothers recount that when Joseph was in that pit, he was in anguish, calling out for help, begging for mercy, while they callously ate their meal. And when they do finally pull him up out of the pit, it's about to get a whole lot worse when he's sold. Too bad in that moment, Joseph doesn't see what we know what happens in the story. God's not going to let anything happen to him. God's with him in that pit and already has a plan in motion to save him. Now, we could have a whole conversation about figurative pits we have all been in at one time or another, seasons or times in our lives when we feel cheated, beaten down, or in over our heads. Even worse, times when we might have had expectations of people, maybe even family, and they betray us, or dreams or hopes for something, and then they're lost. Are we able to wait out these times to remember that God is with us? Or do we let circumstances and fear shake us? But just like Joseph, we can rest assured that Jesus is with us in the pit and in the process. We can hold fast to the promise that our rescue plan is in motion. We may not see it, but we know that in all things, God works it all for good for those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. So this brings us to question number 2. To follow Jesus, there will be moments of invitation where you are no longer permitted to stay in, doing, believing, or trusting what you are today. How does God lead you deeper in following him? And so we'll finish off with the last part of the chapter, verse 31. So they took Joseph's tunic, killed a kid of the goats, and dipped the tunic in the blood, and then sent the tunic of many colors. And they brought it to their father and said, "We have found this. Do you know whether it's your son's tunic or not?" And he recognized it and said, "It is my son's tunic. A wild beast has devoured him." Without a doubt, Joseph is torn into pieces. Then Jacob tore his clothes, put sackcloth on his waist, and mourned his son for many days. And all his sons and all his daughters arose to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. And he said, "For I shall go down into the grave to my son in mourning." Thus his father wept for him. And now the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and captain of the guard. In chapter 37, the foreshadowing of Jesus, the better Joseph, is really hard to ignore. And I'm sure as you listened, you were capturing images and words that all point to Jesus. And as the next teachers present, you're going to continue to see this. I'm not giving any spoilers. I'm going to stay in my lane of 37, and I'm going to wrap up now with just some parallels that were in this chapter. So both Joseph and Jesus had plots against them to be killed. Joseph's brothers did not believe his dreams, and Jesus's brethren did not believe his words. Both were teased and mocked. Reuben had a plan to save Joseph, and Pilate had a plan to save Jesus. People feasted while they were both in anguish. Both were stripped and humiliated, both sold for shekels of silver by a person with a similar name, Judah and Judas, and handed over to somebody else. Joseph's blood-sprinkled coat with the goat blood was presented to his father, and Jesus is our scapegoat, and his blood was presented to the Father as a sin offering. And while we are not yet done with the story of Joseph in this chapter, his being pulled up out of the pit means there's still hope for him. He's still alive. And how great is it for all of us that Jesus, on the third day, resurrected from the tomb? So the two lives of Esau and Joseph show us two paths, one of the world and one of following Jesus. And I'm interested now, as we get to the discussion questions, to hear how the Holy Spirit spoke to you today. For me, as a person, I feel I can learn from Esau's mistakes to keep my family on track. But I also feel that I got to hang on tight like Joseph, to listen carefully to where God might be leading me or what he's saying to me. And I know that if I ever find myself in a pit, God's sovereign, and all things are going to work together for good for those who love him. And it's 6:30. If you are a person that needs to go to work, we're going to send you on your way. God bless you and keep you, and his face shine on you.